I never thought cooking for my cousin could feel like this. I mean, I'd made meals before, but this, standing in her tiny kitchen, the smell of garlic and roasted chicken thick in the air, it carried a weight I couldn't name. I had expected a polite thanks and a quick dinner, maybe some small talk about work or school. I hadn't expected the way she looked at me. She was leaning against the counter, arms crossed loosely, watching me stir the sauce. There was this quiet confidence in the tilt of her head, the way her fingers traced the rim of her coffee mug absent-mindedly. Mid-40s, they said, but she carried herself like she was untouchable, like she'd lived enough to see through most nonsense, but still found small things worth noticing. And somehow, the smallest notice felt like it was aimed only at me. "I didn't realize you cooked," she said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was smooth, measured, but with an undertone I couldn't read. Curiosity? Amusement? Something more? I shrugged, trying not to let my hands tremble as I stirred. Not often. I mostly survive on instant noodles and bad decisions. I laughed, but it came out a little too loud, a little too nervous. She smiled, a slow, easy smile that didn't reach her eyes entirely. "Well, I suppose even bad decisions can smell good." And then she looked down at the counter again, letting the pause stretch just long enough for my chest to tighten. There was no rush to fill the silence. No desperate chatter. Just that tiny, electric space between us. I handed her a plate when it was ready. Our fingers brushed lightly. Nothing dramatic, just accidental. Or maybe not. I caught a glimpse of her eyes, steady, assessing, and something unnameable fluttered in my stomach. "You didn't have to make all this," she said, but her lips curved like she was hiding a secret. "I wanted to," I said quickly, though my voice sounded smaller than I intended. And I meant it, though I didn't entirely understand why. She ate slowly, savoring each bite like she was performing a quiet ritual. I watched her, feeling that odd mixture of pride and guilt, wondering why I felt this odd, nervous thrill at her glance. There was a softness there, a patience, but also something sharp, an awareness of me, not just as a cousin, but as something I couldn't label. We fell into an easy rhythm, her silence contrasting with my awkward attempts at conversation. I asked about her work, her weekend, the bookstore she liked around the corner. She answered, but she often diverted with a small smile, a tilt of her head, letting me fill the space with my own words and clumsiness. And yet, I felt like she was listening to everything, not just hearing, but noticing. After dinner, she stacked the dishes and left them near the sink. I lingered at the stove, cleaning up, but my mind kept drifting back to her. The way her hand had brushed mine, the almost imperceptible pause before she spoke, the curve of her smile when she looked at me. I stood there a moment longer, imagining her coming back into the kitchen, leaning against the counter again, maybe teasing me about how long I'd take to wash a dish. But she didn't. She left me with the quiet and the smell of roasted chicken, and something heavier, something that made me realize I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had looked at me that evening, like she'd seen a version of me I didn't even know existed. And maybe, I thought as I dried the last plate, that was the part one wasn't supposed to understand yet. It wasn't planned. I told myself that a quick trip to help her organize the small bookstore in her neighborhood was just cousinly support. But as soon as I stepped in, the air felt heavier, charged in a way I hadn't expected. She was perched on a ladder, sorting through a stack of worn hardcover books, and for a moment, I just watched. Her hair had that effortless fall, some strands catching the afternoon light. The way she moved, precise but relaxed, made me want to memorize her gestures, even though I knew I shouldn't. "Careful," I said, taking the box she was about to hand down. "I don't want to be responsible for crushing any rare editions." She gave a faint smile, eyes not meeting mine. "I doubt you'd survive the wrath of a collector," she said, her voice even but slightly breathless, as if she was holding back more than just words. I handed her another box, and our hands brushed again, just barely, but it sent an unexpected jolt through me. I noticed the calluses on her fingers, the way she adjusted her grip instinctively. There was a quiet strength about her, layered, careful, deliberate, and yet a vulnerability peeked through in the slight slump of her shoulders. She paused, leaning against the shelf, and I saw it. The exhaustion in her eyes, the faint crease of worry that didn't belong to the books. She didn't say anything, but I felt it, the weight she carried that she refused to voice. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, almost afraid to break the delicate bubble of silence. She looked at me then, and for the first time, something slipped. Not a confession, not exactly, but a flicker, an almost imperceptible sigh, the quick glance away, the tightening of her jaw. "I'm fine," she said, but it didn't sound like it. I wanted to reach out, to say more, to somehow ease whatever it was, but I didn't. I just stayed there, observing, letting her presence sink into me. I noticed the way her laugh came slower when she smiled at one of my clumsy jokes, the way she rubbed the back of her neck absent-mindedly, the faint perfume that lingered and made the air around her feel warmer. We worked in silence for a while, moving boxes, arranging books. I could feel the space between us stretching and contracting, a tension that wasn't there the last time. She was guarded, careful, yet each small movement, each fleeting glance, pulled me closer without words. Then she stepped down from the ladder, brushing her hands on her apron, and something in her expression made my stomach tighten. A brief look, a hesitant pause before she turned away. It was as if she'd almost said something, almost allowed herself to lean on me, and then held back. I caught my breath, suddenly aware of how loud my own heartbeat felt. The room smelled faintly of old paper and lavender, and I realized I was holding my hand just a little too close to hers, waiting. And when she finally looked at me again, just for a fraction of a second, there was a softness there, quiet, dangerous, and completely unspoken. I couldn't stop noticing it. The rain started just as we were closing up the bookstore. Thick sheets of it, hammering against the windows, drumming on the roof. Inside, the space felt smaller, cozier, and the dim light made shadows dance across her face in a way that made it impossible for me to look away. She handed me a stack of books to put on the counter. Our hands brushed again, longer this time, almost deliberately, and I caught myself holding the moment, afraid to move first. There was a strange rhythm to us, a push and pull I couldn't name. "You're soaked," I said, glancing at her coat, already damp from the storm outside. "I can handle it," she murmured, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. But her shoulders slumped slightly, and the tension in her jaw gave her away. She was tired, more tired than she admitted. We moved closer, reaching for the same book. Our fingers collided, lingered, and for a heartbeat, the room fell silent except for the rain. My chest tightened, a part of me urging to lean in, to say something, anything, that could bridge the distance. But I held myself back. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a message flashing from someone whose name I didn't recognize. She glanced at it, hesitation crossing her face, then ignored it. That tiny choice, ignoring it, made my stomach twist in ways I hadn't expected. There was a story there, something unspoken, and suddenly the quiet between us carried even more weight. "You ever think," I started, my voice lower than I intended, "that sometimes things happen even when we don't want them to?" She paused, fingers stilling on the book. Her eyes flicked up, meeting mine just long enough for me to see a flicker of vulnerability before she looked away. "Sometimes," she said softly, almost too softly, as if saying more would unravel something delicate. I wanted to reach for her hand again, to anchor myself in that tiny warmth, but I didn't. Instead, I just exhaled, keeping my own impulses in check. Thunder rolled, and the vibration shook the windows. She shivered slightly, and without thinking, I moved a fraction closer, just to let my coat brush against hers. The brief contact was electric, and I caught a glimpse of her breath hitch ever so slightly. Then, the storm outside seemed to insist on breaking the spell. The door rattled as a late customer stepped in, dripping and apologetic. The moment snapped. She straightened immediately, smoothing her hair and forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We both laughed, lightly, awkwardly, as if to convince ourselves that the storm, and whatever had been building between us, was nothing more than coincidence. But I stayed a second longer than necessary, hand still hovering near hers, caught between wanting to pull away and wanting to lean in. And for a moment, when our eyes met again, there was a silent question lingering in the air, unasked, unanswered. I couldn't stop noticing it. We didn't say much that evening. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and quiet, and the soft hum of the city filtered through the open window. I was perched on the edge of the sofa in her apartment, trying to appear casual, while she moved around the kitchen, stacking empty mugs and wiping the counter. Every gesture felt deliberate, heavy with an unspoken weight. Finally, she stopped, leaning against the sink, arms crossed. Her eyes lingered on mine longer than usual, and I felt a jolt of something I couldn't name. Anticipation, fear, longing, all at once. What are we doing?" she asked quietly, almost as if she were talking to herself. Her words hit harder than a shout. I froze. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way she said them, strained, almost fragile, like she'd been carrying them alone for too long. I opened my mouth, then closed it, realizing I didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound like a lie. She stepped closer, slow, measured. "I mean this. Us. How I feel around you. How you look at me." I swallowed. My heart hammered, but I didn't reach out. I couldn't. I started, but the words tangled in my throat. She let out a short laugh, almost bitter, and shook her head. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't try to explain it. You won't." Her vulnerability was raw, stripped of pretense. I noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders slumped even though she tried to stand tall. It was disarming, terrifying even, how human she looked. Not the untouchable, confident woman I'd admired from afar, but someone fragile and real. I moved a fraction closer, careful not to cross the invisible boundary she'd drawn. My own silence felt loud in the small apartment. I wanted to speak, to promise her something, anything, but the words felt hollow in the shadow of her honesty. "I don't know if I should be here," she murmured, almost to herself. Her eyes met mine, searching, questioning, or if I should even want to be. I could see the conflict etched in every line of her face. I wanted to hold her, to anchor her somehow, but I stayed still, my hands folded loosely in my lap. The ache in my chest was sharp, a mix of desire, frustration, and fear. She took a deep breath, leaning her forehead against the edge of the counter. I think I'm afraid," she admitted finally, voice breaking just enough for me to catch it. "Afraid of what it means if we stop pretending, if we don't hide it anymore." The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I could feel her pulse through the thin fabric of her shirt as she shifted slightly, and I realized that the tension between us wasn't just about desire. It was about truth. The truth we weren't ready to face. I started again, but she shook her head, cutting me off with a fragile, almost imperceptible sigh. Her eyes met mine one last time before she stepped back, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know if I can do this, or if I want to." And then she was gone from the sofa, leaving me with silence heavier than anything I'd felt before. I found her sitting at the small kitchen table the next morning, a cup of coffee untouched in front of her. The sunlight was weak, barely spilling past the blinds, and it painted everything in shades of gray. She looked smaller somehow, hunched over, as if the night had left invisible weight on her shoulders. I sat across from her, unsure whether to speak or just wait. The quiet between us had grown thick, almost tangible. She didn't look up, fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "You ever lose someone and keep waiting for them to come back?" she asked suddenly, voice low, hesitant. It wasn't a question aimed at me. Exactly. It felt like she was asking the air or herself. I paused, unsure how to answer. I didn't want to say the wrong thing, didn't want to pretend I understood. "Sometimes," I said softly. "I think some people never really leave, even if they're gone." She looked up then, eyes glistening, and for the first time in our time together, the confident mask she wore slipped entirely. He was my first. I was too young, and I didn't fight hard enough. And then one day, he just left. No explanations. No goodbyes. She swallowed, eyes dropping again. And I've spent years trying not to feel it. I didn't know what to say. My chest tightened in that way it always did when she revealed a crack in her armor. I wanted to reach across the table, touch her hand, but I hesitated, afraid to be too much, afraid to be too little. I started and then froze. There was a photo tucked between the pages of a cookbook she'd left open on the counter. A man, smiling, arms around her, warm sunlight catching their hair. I didn't ask, I just looked. She sighed, finally, as if she'd been expecting me to notice. I never meant for you to see that, she said, voice trembling slightly. It's the part of me I try to hide. The part that's still waiting, even if I tell myself I'm not. I nodded, swallowing hard, because somehow that acknowledgement, soft, fragile, human, was heavier than anything she'd said before. I wanted to say more, to explain, to comfort, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just kept watching, silently memorizing the way her shoulders slumped, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the table, the way her eyes caught the light and shimmered with something unsaid. She leaned back then, letting out a breath she'd been holding, and for a moment, it felt like the room itself had tilted slightly. I realized that she wasn't just telling me a story. She was giving me a piece of herself, the part she had fought to keep buried, and that made everything between us feel heavier, yet impossibly closer. Sometimes, she whispered, voice almost lost, I wonder if I'll ever let anyone in again. If I even should. I wanted to answer, to reassure, to cross the table and bridge the distance. But I stayed still, because this moment wasn't about moving. It was about noticing, about understanding, about holding space for her pain. And as she looked at me again, a faint, trembling smile tugging at her lips, I realized that something had shifted. Something fragile, quiet, seismic. We didn't talk much that evening. The air between us had changed, stretched taut, and then settled into something softer, quieter. I helped her clear the last of the dishes, and when our hands brushed, lightly, accidentally, it didn't startle either of us. It just felt expected. She leaned against the counter, eyes tracing the faint scratches in the wood, and I leaned a fraction closer, careful not to close the space completely. Neither of us said anything, because words felt unnecessary, even dangerous. The silence carried everything we hadn't dared to speak. The tension, the longing, the fear, the tiny moments of joy we'd stolen from each other. I don't want to make this complicated, she said finally, voice low and careful. But I also don't want to pretend it's nothing. I nodded, letting my eyes linger on hers. I don't either, I admitted quietly. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't poetic. It was simple, true, and it felt heavier than anything I'd tried to say before. We moved around the apartment together, side by side, stacking books, adjusting cushions, and every small gesture felt intimate. She laughed softly at something I said, and for a moment, the sound filled the space between us like a bridge. I noticed the way her shoulder brushed mine as she reached for a cup, the slight shiver when the evening chill seeped in through the window. At some point, we both ended up on the sofa, sitting in a comfortable, quiet rhythm. She rested her head lightly against my shoulder, just for a second, then pulled back, but the trace of warmth lingered. I didn't move, didn't offer anything more than the space to exist, because that was enough. Minutes passed in silence, filled with the subtle hum of the city outside. Her hand found mine, almost naturally, and our fingers intertwined without discussion, without decision. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an admission. It was simply being. I think, she whispered, eyes tracing the pattern in the carpet. We don't have to force it. Just let it be what it is. I squeezed her hand gently. Yeah, I said. Just that. There was no rush, no grand gestures, no fireworks. Just the slow acknowledgement of what had been building all along. The quiet collapse into something that felt inevitable because we had both earned it, in our own messy, human way. We leaned back slightly, our shoulders touching, hands still linked. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. She let out a soft sigh, not of relief, not of finality, but simply of presence, of allowing herself to exist in this shared space without pretense. And for the first time since this had started, I didn't feel the need to think ahead, to calculate, to worry. I just existed, aware of her warmth, aware of the steady rhythm of her breath, aware that this moment, quiet, fragile, perfectly human, was ours. I realized then that we didn't need declarations. We didn't need promises. We only needed to be here, together, however softly, however slowly. And that was enough. I still remember the way the apartment smelled that evening. The faint mix of roasted chicken and coffee, the trace of lavender from her perfume, the quiet hum of the city outside. It's strange how certain moments stick, how you can replay the smallest details years later and feel them again, just as sharp. We didn't rush into anything after that night. There were no grand declarations, no whirlwind confessions. Just a slow unfolding, like sunlight spilling across a room over hours, gentle but inevitable. I watched her laugh more freely, noticed the way her shoulders eased when she thought no one was looking. And she noticed me, too, not as a younger cousin she had to protect or teach, but as someone who could see her fully, who could hold her space without judgment. I changed, too, though in ways I didn't recognize immediately. I learned patience, learned that longing could coexist with respect, that desire didn't always have to scream to be real. I learned to notice the small, subtle gestures, the pauses in conversation, the weight of a glance that said more than words ever could. We shared quiet evenings, early mornings, moments that seemed almost ordinary but carried all the intensity we never spoke aloud. There were books read side by side, mugs of coffee held between our hands, soft laughter echoing through the rooms. There were also silences, long, tender, sometimes heavy, but they were no longer unbearable. They were ours. I realized then that love wasn't always about fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it was simply about being present, noticing the tiny vulnerabilities and holding them with care. Sometimes it was about letting someone exist in your life without trying to fix them and being fixed yourself simply by noticing that they were there. She never needed me to solve her past heartbreak, and I never needed her to erase mine. We just needed to let it be what it was, quietly building something stronger in the spaces we shared. And in that subtle, patient way, the slow burn became a steady light. Sometimes, I still catch myself smiling at a memory of her, how she'd brush a stray strand of hair behind her ear, or the brief, hesitant pause before her hand met mine. Those small moments, the ones that felt inconsequential then, are the ones that have stayed with me. And I think that's what we learned. Love doesn't always need words. It doesn't need permission or explanation. It needs attention, presence, and the courage to sit in the quiet with someone who matters. I glance at her now across the room, quietly reading, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and I realize that the world hasn't changed. Only us. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?